What battles took place in the southern theater of the Revolutionary War that finally allowed the American soldier to win? What role did France play in the final victory? And how did General Washington stop a conspiracy of officers at Newburgh, New York? For answers to these questions, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we are covering the final stages of the Revolutionary War, or what's best described as the War in the South, which led to the final victory. Joining me is Revolutionary War historian John Maas. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you here. So a little bit about John. Dr. John R. Maas is an education staff member of the new National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. He received his BA from Washington and Lee University and his PhD in early American history at The Ohio State University. He served in the 80th Division of the U.S. Army Reserve. Dr. Maas is also the author of several books and numerous articles on early U.S. military history, including The Road to Yorktown, Jefferson, Lafayette, and the British Invasion of Virginia in 2015, George Washington's Virginia in 2017, and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, a most desperate engagement in 2020. Wow, that's pretty cool. A lot of history there. What am I missing? Anything else that you've done?
I was the author of two publications done by the Army Center of Military History. One was in the War of 1812 series. I did the first volume, which was called Defending the New Nation, which went from immediately after the Revolutionary War in 1784 through 1811, right before the War of 1812, really through the Battle of Tippecanoe. And then I wrote the volume of the Civil War series on the Petersburg and Appomattox campaigns.
Oh, okay.
So I had a lot of fun doing those, particularly the one on Petersburg and Appomattox. Enjoyed it a lot.
Now, are you from Virginia? Is that why you have a connection to that?
I have lived in Virginia since I was 11.
Oh, wow.
Over in the Lexington, Rockbridge County area.
All right, well, good. Well, but today we're going to pick your brain about the Revolutionary War, and specifically, as we mentioned, the war in the South. So let's shift to that. You know, previously we've spoken about the war in the Middle States and in the northern colonies, but in late 1778, early 1779, the British shifted their main effort to the South. Why was that?
Well, the background is that the emphasis became on securing the territory of the South at this period. The British were under the impression that there was a huge number of loyalists in the South, mostly in the Carolinas and Georgia, and they were being told in London that a significant force, if it arrived in the South, the loyalists would flock to it, and they would form their own military units, and that would be easy to do and basically conquer the Carolinas and Georgia. They were also interested in shifting the war to the South because by this time, France had come in to the war on the side of the Americans, and the big emphasis became capturing or retaining the various sugar islands in the West Indies. So they wanted an area in the South to use as a base for those operations.
All right, then let's talk about what the American Army looked like in the South. What was the size, type of forces that they had? And I mean, I know that we had official Continental Army. I'm guessing we had militia. But also, what role did the American Indians or freed black men and French forces play?
Well, other than two campaigns, Yorktown and 1781, and then Charlestown, which is now Charleston, South Carolina, in 1780, which had very large forces on both sides, Yorktown and in particular. But most of the battles and engagements in the South, even the most famous ones we know of, were very small affairs. Most of the time, the British had less than 3,000 troops, and the Americans less than 5,000, even at Guilford Courthouse. So they weren't big, large-scale engagements such as the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse or the Saratoga Campaign or Brandywine near Philadelphia. They were quite small. And in addition to those types of units you just mentioned, it's important to note that the militia were in existence for both the Patriot side and the Loyalist side. There were many regiments and companies raised, even put in uniform to fight alongside the British. In fact, one of the more famous ones that folks might have heard of is Tarleton's Legion. Tarleton was a cavalry commander in the South, notorious for brutality, deserved or not deserved. But his unit, the British Legion, was a Loyalist unit. In the South, the Indians mostly were important during the beginning of the war. There was a 1776 campaign that was launched from Virginia and North Carolina against the Cherokees in what is now western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. Then there were some units of African Americans, the two most famous ones being a regiment from Rhode Island that was made up of numerous freemen, and they fought during the Yorktown campaign. But early in the war, in 1775, the governor of Virginia put out a call for slaves to run away to the British that were in the Tidewater area, and that they would be freed, and they would be clothed and armed, and it was called the Loyal Ethiopian Regiment. And of course, that enraged slave owners and actually probably tilted many loyalists or neutral slave owners toward the Patriot cause because they were losing what they considered to be their property.
So the British thinking that we had that loyalists would join up. There's truth to that to some degree. Then
right, there were quite a number of loyalist regiments that were raised in the South, and then for various campaigns, loyalist units that were raised in the North were shipped to the South in order to be in some of the campaigns.
And then let's talk about the American leaders at this point here in the South. They see the British coming down. Who were the key leaders here, and what was their strategy to defend against the British? Well,
the two key commanders for the Americans during the Southern campaign from 1780 through 1783, the first one was Horatio Gates, and he was the hero of Saratoga. He was the American commander during the Saratoga campaign that was successful against the British. But when he got to the South, to paraphrase a general that was not his friend, his northern laurels turned into southern willows, which meant that he faced a disastrous brief campaign at the Battle of Camden on August 16th, 1780 in South Carolina, where the American force was routed. And once that happened, Washington, at Congress's request, chose the next commander himself, which was Nathaniel Greene, who was a Rhode Islander. And Greene arrived in the South in early December of 1780, And it was after that you had some of the more well-known Southern battles, such as Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, Hobkirk Hill, and Eutaw Springs. Those were four of the battles that Greene was the commander of. And he was a very talented man. He had been the George Washington's quartermaster for a year or so. And he knew logistics, and he knew, just like Washington knew, that his job was not to try to defeat the British in battle, but to avoid getting his own army defeated. He had to stay on. He had to have an army on the ground to represent the cause of independence.
Uh-huh.
And there were some subordinates below him. Daniel Morgan was another, the American commander at the Battle of Cowpens, a brilliant victory. There were several what we call today guerrilla leaders, meaning small units of hit-and-run type tactics. The most famous one probably being Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox from South Carolina, but also Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens, who were both also from South Carolina.
Uh-huh. So you've already talked about Camden. So it was a big loss for the American forces.
Right.
So what happened after Camden? So Washington replaces Gates with Greene, and then where did the battles go after that?
So Greene arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina on December 2nd, 1780, and that's where he took over command from Gates. It's important to note that the stylized imagery, either in film, TV, or what's depicted in paintings of the American uniforms and equipment and what have you, is just false. You can read Greene's reports, Morgan's reports, letters, correspondence of a lot of officers from the Army. Half the men were so ill-clad that they couldn't report for drill on the parade ground. A lot of them had no shoes, just in tatters, only had blankets to wear.
And are you talking about the militia, or are you talking about
This is the Continentals.
Oh, wow.
Yep. It was very difficult to resupply them, and Greene figured that out pretty fast when he was on his way from West Point to take up his command in the South. As he went south, he stopped in Philadelphia, Annapolis, and Richmond to try to get those states to provide more money and supplies and equipment. And he figured out pretty early on his trip down that it was going to be very, very difficult. So he faced a lot of challenges logistically and with equipment, weapons, just even having people to repair wagons for his use or muskets that were broken. But he triumphed in the end.
Right. And let's talk really quick. We've talked about the American leaders. Who are the British leaders? Who are we facing here?
Well, the big attack was on Charleston, South Carolina, as I mentioned, in the early part of 1780. And that was a large expedition that came from New York City by boat, and thousands of troops and artillery, even cavalry came on the ships. And that was led by Sir Henry Clinton, who was the commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America. His second in command was probably a name most folks would know, which was Charles Lord Cornwallis. Mm-hmm. The two of them did not get along at all. They were enemies. They did not work well together during the campaign. But Charleston fell in May of 1780, and soon after that, Clinton sailed back with part of the troops to New York. And for the rest of the period, it was really Cornwallis who was the commander in Cowpens. He wasn't physically there, but a detachment of under Tarleton was there. Camden, Guilford Courthouse, and then eventually Yorktown.
Right. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the Battle of Cowpens and kind of what led up to that, because I just find that the tactics that were used there were really very interesting. The militia, I guess, they hadn't, talk to me about that, but my understanding is they had not been performing as well as the Continental Army. and that the commander, was it Greene or Morgan
Morgan.
at Morgan, that used that to his advantage. Can you explain that?
Yes, they had very poor performance evaluations throughout the Southern campaigns.
Militias, yeah.
So at Cowpens, which is in what's called the upcountry of South Carolina, it's west of Charlotte. If you're driving in that area today, it's near Gaffney, about an hour west drive from Charlotte. It's a very pretty national battlefield park. The Park Service owns it. Morgan had been detached from the Army with a small force of about 800 Continentals or so, and he was detached by General Greene, who took the rest of the Army farther to the east in an area it's called Cheraw. That's in South Carolina also, on the PD River. And Morgan was tasked with kind of causing trouble for the British among their western outposts. Most notably was a place oddly named 96 South Carolina. Yeah. So the British had a base there, and Cornwallis, as he was moving north from Winnsboro, South Carolina, to move into North Carolina, he detached Tarleton, Bannister Tarleton, who's a hard-driving, aggressive cavalry commander, to meet up with and destroy Morgan's force. So Morgan was retreating north. This was to the west. These actions between Tarleton and Morgan were to the west of Cornwallis's axis of advance toward North Carolina. Eventually, Morgan gathered militia from North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia to supplement his force. He realized that Tarleton, whose troops were mostly mounted, was going to catch up with them, and he did not want to be in the middle of crossing a river when Tarleton and his men approached. It would be very dangerous. So he stopped 4 or 5 miles before the last river he had to cross, the Broad River, and he set up his defensive position in what today we would call a defense in depth. He set up 3 lines. The first line was riflemen, and they were supposed to delay Tarleton's initial advance to try to knock the plans that the British had off the rails a little bit, maybe produce some casualties. And they only really had to fire 2 or 3 volleys, and then they could fall back to the second line and beyond. And the second line was made up of militia, and Morgan also instructed them, give 2 or 3 volleys, again, to disrupt the advance of Tarleton's troops. And then the third line on a rise, it's not even really a ridge, it's kind of a low hill, though that's where he put his Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware Continentals, was on that third line. And so he was hoping that by the time the British attacked the third line, they would have been disrupted. He also had a small cavalry contingent that was hidden behind that hill under William Washington, who was a distant cousin of George Washington. And he was a Continental cavalry officer. So Tarleton, with his own loyalists and cavalry, and he also had 1 battalion of the 71st Regiment and the 7th Regiment of Foot, attacked what I would call impetuously. He did not wait for all of the troops to come up. He was full steam ahead. There's this rebel militia. We know they're going to run. But Morgan's plan worked, and the militia knew that if they would just fire 2 or 3 volleys, they could fall back, regroup behind the Continentals. Right. And in the end, what happened was what was called a double envelopment, which is where the Americans were able to stand fast in the center and then hit Tarleton's flanks at the same time with their cavalry and infantry. And so Tarleton, out of a force of about 1,000, lost about 875.
Wow.
Most of them captured.
Wow.
Most captured. It was a tremendous victory. The Americans got 2 field pieces, which were very hard to come by for them, and so that was really Morgan's main achievement in the South. That was January 17th, 1781.
Yeah, significant victory for the American Army, and then moving north. Right. So after this battle, we want to get up to Guilford Courthouse. I think that's something you know a lot about.
Yes, I do.
You wrote a book about that.
did.
So what happened there, and what was the significance of that?
So after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Morgan sent a detachment of his men to guard all those prisoners
After
Cowpens, directly north to secure them. But he moved northeast to cross the main river in western North Carolina, which is the Catawba. And it was flooded. He was able to get across. Cornwallis was not able to cross because the Americans had removed almost all the boats. They faced him on the Catawba River at the end of January. Meanwhile, Greene brought the rest of the army to Guilford Courthouse, and that's where Morgan was heading. The British managed to cross the Catawba at Cowan's Ford, and Greene realized that his main army joined with Morgan's contingent. He was still too weak, his troops still poorly equipped to face Cornwallis in battle. So he decided to move into Virginia, and after that there was a period of about 2 weeks called the Race to the Dan. Actually, it was about a week, and Greene was trying to get across the Dan River into Virginia, where he'd be more easily supplied. And Cornwallis gave chase. The Americans were able to cross the Dan at a place in Virginia that's now called South Boston. It's near the Virginia-North Carolina line in Halifax County. And the British showed up on the other side of the bank about 8 hours later, having not been able to catch up. That followed another kind of 2-week period where they sparred with each other a little bit. Greene changed his campsites almost every evening just to keep the British off their balance. Cornwallis needed to move to a little bit more of a easier way to get supplied, so he moved his position by March 14th to central North Carolina, very close to modern High Point, North Carolina. And Greene decided on the 14th that he had been reinforced by extra continental units from Virginia and Maryland and thousands of North Carolina, Virginia militia. So he figured this is my chance. I may not ever have that many troops under my command again. He was correct. And he was moving to attack Cornwallis. Now, one of the things that I've pointed out in my book is that almost every printed source, modern either book, website, article, encyclopedia entry, says that Greene took up a defensive position at Guilford Courthouse, which he had seen 2 weeks earlier, and waited for the British to attack. It's incorrect. All the contemporary evidence, including Greene's reports, Light Horse Harry Lee's reports, William Washington's reports, they all state that Greene was moving toward Cornwallis's position to attack.
Oh, well.
However, at 3 a.m. on the 15th of March, Light Horse Harry Lee's scouts reported that Cornwallis was coming after Greene. So Greene said, okay, well, let's just stay in our position. The battle was several hours long. He used a similar defense in depth that he had gotten from Daniel Morgan. Unfortunately, he put all the North Carolinians and the militia in the first line, bolstered by regular troops on the flanks. Many of them ran without firing a shot. Oh, wow. Cornwallis used a head-on approach, which is there was no real finesse to his battle plan. He saw militia and attacked. That's what he did at Camden. It was very successful. The Virginians in the second line were much better at staying in their lines. Many of them had been Continental soldiers before, and their terms had expired, and they were doing militia duty. They stood for many volleys. Finally, the British were so disrupted that they arrived at the 3rd American line near the courthouse, which consisted of artillery and 4 Continental regiments, 2 Virginia, 2 Maryland. The left flank of Greene's position gave way. Everyone else was standing fast, and Greene decided, again, with this prudence of needing to have an army in the field, that discretion was the better part of valor, as they say, and he led an orderly retreat to a predetermined location. And so Cornwallis technically won the battle in 18th century terms by holding the field, but his army suffered 25% casualties and even higher among the officers. And remember, this is an army that had been on the move since July of 1780 and had marched to Camden, Cowpens, and Guilford by March. They were in just as bad a condition in some ways as the Americans were.
So after this, what did Cornwallis do?
Well, Cornwallis decided to abandon his attempt to conquer North Carolina, and he moved to Wilmington to get resupplied. And because of that, I argue that the key battle in the South during the Revolutionary War in this final 1780, 1781 time period was Guilford Courthouse, not Cowpens. Because if you look at it, Cornwallis advanced after Camden, and when the Americans won a victory, a militia victory at Kings Mountain, Cornwallis retreated, but then advanced again. He lost a huge part of his army at Cowpens in January of 1781, but did not retreat. He kept going. And it was only Guilford Courthouse where he won the battle, but had to retreat and abandon his campaign. That's a turning point. That is a strategic turning point that was decisive, whereas the other battles he kept advancing. It was only Guilford Courthouse, that battle, that caused him to stop advancing, to give up that attempt.
And what did Greene and the American army do? Did they pursue Cornwallis?
They did. Cornwallis basically marched down the Cape Fear River all the way to Wilmington by way of what was at that time called Campbelltown, but is now known as Fayetteville, home of Fort Bragg. So Greene pursued Cornwallis, but once they approached Wilmington, he decided that he was going to move his army into South Carolina and try to retake that area. He knew Cornwallis was fairly weak at that point in April of 1781, and Cornwallis could either chase him or get water transportation back to Charlestown. But Greene was really risking a lot by leaving Cornwallis in the rear. But he was in friendly territory, Greene was, and as we know, Cornwallis did not chase Greene after all.
Right. So let's talk about Yorktown. How did Cornwallis end up getting to Yorktown? What was the American response to that?
So after Guilford Courthouse and both armies moved toward Wilmington, then again Greene moved into South Carolina, Greene doesn't have anything more to do at that point, really, with the Yorktown campaign. So at the end of April, Cornwallis decided to move to Virginia. He said, unless Virginia is subdued, that the war will not be won, because Virginia was really providing the equipment, the food, reinforcements in several areas in central and Virginia and Richmond, Chesterfield, those areas. So Cornwallis decided he was going to take the army and meet up with another smaller force that was under General William Phillips at Petersburg and the traitor Benedict Arnold. So Cornwallis eventually moved into Virginia and took command, had a fairly large army. The campaign between Cornwallis and the Americans in Virginia is the subject of my book, The Road to Yorktown. The Americans, Virginians, were able to have some troops, militia troops, but they're very ineffective. So Washington realized that he had to do something to help Virginia stay in the war. So he sent a contingent of about 1,000 American Continental Light Infantrymen under the Marquis de Lafayette, all the way from New Jersey to Richmond. And there was a campaign of about a month, all in central Virginia between Richmond and Charlottesville. Eventually, Cornwallis decided that he was going to move to the coast to get resupplied and figure out, what they needed to do to kind of subdue Virginia. So they eventually moved down to Williamsburg, and Washington and the French, our allies, planned a campaign that was going to be one of an alliance with the French, who would supply troops and, more importantly, a naval asset to be able to get in at the British in the Tidewater area. So eventually Cornwallis was looking for a suitable port for mainline ships and that was defensible against the weather also. And after several choices or explorations of other places, they chose Yorktown on the York River.
Right. And then the American forces with the French, they come in. And what happens? There's a siege, I think.
So right at the beginning of September through October 17th was the siege of Yorktown. The key battle, though, was the Battle of the Capes, which was the French Navy against the British Navy, which is very complicated. And I'm not a naval historian,
right.
But the long story short is that the French were able to prevent the British Navy from getting to Yorktown and resupplying Cornwallis and protecting him. And once they had bottled up the Chesapeake Bay, that it was only a matter of time at that point. So the French and the Americans, the French under Rochambeau, they marched and sailed and brought their men and equipment basically down what is now I-95. Wasn't that it was not called that at the time. And were able to successfully lay siege to the British defenses at Yorktown, and there was also a section across from Yorktown on Gloucester Point that there was also some positions, and eventually
Across the river,
across the York River in what was then Gloucester County. But finally, the British surrendered their entire force of redcoats and Hessians and loyalists, and that really was the final nail in the coffin, so to speak. That was the second British force to have been surrounded and captured, and that was going to do it. Because remember, while this is going on, there's still that battle for the islands in the West Indies.
Oh, right,
And
yes.
so, this was a major army that was lost, and they really had to focus on one or the other at that point.
Now, a lot of people think, and I know I used to, so I learned more about it here, that, here's Yorktown. We win at Yorktown, we defeat the British, the Revolutionary War is over. But that's not quite accurate.
That is not accurate. The British still maintained their position in New York City, which they actually held until November of 1783. and Charleston, which they also held into the fall of 1783. They were also still held Canada. At that point, Clinton, Cornwallis, the Howe brothers, all those names that we know from the beginning of the war, those guys were all back in England, and the overall commander was Sir Guy Carleton, whose headquarters was at Quebec. And he kind of oversaw the British logistics in these positions, but for the most part, Charleston, New York, and some other isolated small garrisons. There were minor skirmishes. Greene's other two battles that he fought, Hobkirk's Hill and Utah Springs, they actually were over before Yorktown. So it kind of petered out into negotiations and eventually the Treaty of Paris in 1783.
Right. So what happened to the American army then between the American victory in Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris? Did the American army then surround the areas where the British were? Did they end up going home? What happened?
So in the South, General Greene was still the commander until the surrender, and he kept a very small army, usually less than 1,000 men on foot, with just enough power and militia support to be able to keep the British in Charleston and prevent them from making excursions. But there were really no major battles during that point. In the North, after Yorktown, Washington moved his army immediately back to New York to keep an eye on the British. The main American camps were in the area of West Point, Newburgh, and on what's called the Hudson Highlands near West Point, and some other places too. Virginia, there's a few in Virginia, but really they were just kind of waiting it out at that point.
But I understand that there were some morale issues. There were some pay issues, a little disappointment within the force, and especially with the leadership. Can you address those issues? Because that led up to what we'll talk about in a minute at Newburgh.
Right. So the Americans had not been paid, the soldiers, the rank and file, had not been paid, oftentimes for years at a time. In fact, when the French sent their reinforcing fleet right before Yorktown, they stopped in Cuba in order to get cash, basically a specie, currency, hard money, so that the Americans could get paid. And Rochambeau and Lafayette and others had told them, if we don't get some money in these soldiers' hands, they may not stay around for the whole show. And the same thing kind of happened up in the New York area. The issue with the officers was that a lot of them had given up years with no pay or low pay. Others that they missed opportunities home, their farms or plantations or businesses or shipping concerns. Were in horrible condition, including Mount Vernon. I mean, George Washington worried about Mount Vernon in the same way. And initially, they had been promised pensions after the war, land grants, bounties, things along those lines. And as the war went on, as most folks know, the credit worthiness of the country deteriorated rapidly. There were so many loans that the individual states had taken out, and there were more loans that the Continental Congress had taken out. That's what Ben Franklin was doing over in Europe, was to try to get French and Dutch loans. So they were worried that the war was just going to kind of trickle out over time, and that once the treaty was signed, that Congress was going to figuratively throw up its hands and say, thanks for helping out, guys, but we don't have any money whatsoever to pay you. Mm-hmm. And so there were some rumblings about petitioning Congress, and sending a contingent to Congress to explain it. But others had a more dangerous kind of approach, saying, no, we need to march the army or part of the army and show Congress that we mean business. Yeah. And there was a secret meeting called at Newburgh, which was one of the Army's cantonments on the Hudson River, and it was chaired by angry officers at a meeting in a large meeting room at Newburgh, and Washington got wind of this.
Yeah, he wasn't invited, was he?
He was not invited. Okay. If you're going to have a meeting, you always should invite your commander, whether he comes right. or not, or she comes or not. Mm-hmm. That's different. But so Washington came, and it was totally unexpected. The other officers were shocked and looking around, saying, "What's he doing here? He's not supposed to be here." And what do we do now is probably the bigger question, right? So Washington took out a letter that he was going to read by, I forget who the letter was from, but it was explaining what Congress was trying to do. Mm-hmm. And as he had a brilliant theatrical move, mm-hmm. which was to take out his eyeglasses before he read the letter, and none of the other officers had seen him in glasses before. Yeah. And he said something along the lines of, "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I'm slowly going blind in the service to my country." Oh. So then they're all sitting around like a bunch of chumps, thinking, "Gee, mm-hmm. Yeah, he has kind of sacrificed a lot since 1775, and here I am worried about my money. Mm-hmm. Maybe we'll give Congress another chance." Right. So he diffused that, mm-hmm. And I would add for those who visit the new National Museum of the U.S. Army, we have a separate film just on the Newburgh incident. Mm-hmm. That's very well done. I think folks would really enjoy seeing that explanation.
And part of the importance of that, and why we're really discussing it, is that moment really reaffirmed the civilian control of the U.S. Army or the U.S. military.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Washington and every other officer received their commissions either through the Continental Congress or their state governments, mm-hmm. and that was an important thing. It was kind of re-emphasized when Washington eventually returned home after the British left New York, and he returned to Mount Vernon. One of his stops was Annapolis, where Congress was meeting, to literally give them back his commission. And it was a very impressive moment. And King George III said that if that story were true, then Washington would be the greatest man in the world. Wow. Or something along those lines. But mm-hmm. he was very impressed that mm-hmm. he had given up power. That's where one of Washington's heroes was Cincinnatus, mm-hmm. Of the Roman Republic, who was a farmer and left his farm to serve as the commander of the Roman army at the time, and then when the war was over, he went back to his farm, right. And that's why Washington identified with him quite a bit.
Yeah, it's a great story, and to be recognized by King George for doing that, right. and understanding that, it's pretty amazing. So now we have the Treaty of Paris. The war is officially over. Mm-hmm. What happens to the U.S. Army now? Well,
it was still the Continental Army at the time. And a lot of the men in the ranks had dissolved. It was a very small force. There were still positions at West Point, the focused in that area around New York. The Army was dissolved. The Continental Army was dissolved in 1784. In June or July 84, I'm not sure, June or July of 84. And then the very next day, the U.S. Army was created in Congress. A small force, mostly just to guard the weapons at West Point and what's now the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. That's what the force was for. It's only about 100 men. And
so did we rely? Was the plan then to rely if something came up back on the militias?
Yes, right.
So they stayed active in the States.
Again, yes, but not on foot. They would only be raised if needed.
Okay.
And one interesting point is that the U.S. Army's Old Guard that does the ceremonies and the twilight tattoos, their uniforms are replica of the 1784 uniform, not from the Revolution.
Oh, okay.
They look like they're Revolutionary War soldiers, but people who are experts in uniforms can tell right away, oh, no, that's the 1784 regulations and uniforms.
Well, that's good. And that's a great transition. I mean, thank you so much. This has been really enlightening. A lot of details here about how the Revolutionary War ended and what happened to the U.S. Army. But before we finish, I do like to get a bit of a Hua trivia from our guests here about the time frame we're talking about. So do you have something to share, a wowed piece of Hua trivia?
Sure. It's about my second favorite general. Everyone's favorite general has to be Washington. My second favorite general is Nathaniel Greene. And in a little ironic twist, the trivia would be who or what religious upbringing did Nathaniel Greene have as a child and into his young adulthood?
Oh, I have no idea.
He was a Quaker, which is ironic because the Quakers were and are a pacifist religious sect that was very common in Pennsylvania. We normally associate the Quakers with the Penn family of Pennsylvania. However, there was a very strong and large contingent of Quaker families in Rhode Island, and that was Greene's home colony / state. He fell away from them in his early adulthood. He had joined a militia unit which was not acceptable to Quaker doctrine. And eventually, once he became a commissioned officer in the Continental Army, he was eventually what was called read out of, or basically thrown out of, the Quaker faith by 1777.
That is fascinating. But everything you've shared with us today, it's great information. And thank you so much for being here and for your discussions about the Southern War and the end of the Revolutionary War and your insights about the Newburgh Conspiracy, a very important point, significant moment in American or U.S. Army history. So if anyone wants to learn more about the Revolutionary War or Army history in general, I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And you can also find the publications that Dr. Maas has written for the Center of Military History there as well, just on our publications tab. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please join us every week on this podcast for more in-depth discussions about Army history as we cover topics from all eras of U.S. Army history, examining battles, soldier experiences, equipment, weapons, tactics, and lots of trivia. Thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.